Picture this. You're lying inside a cave, somewhere in what is now southern France, 28,000 years ago. Outside, the wind is moving fast enough to knock you off your feet. The temperature hasn't climbed above freezing in months, and the only thing standing between you and a bad death tonight is a small pile of glowing embers at the center of your shelter. Now picture the fire going out. Not dimming, not fading slowly while someone tends it. Gone. A downpour finds its way through a crack in the rock. A gust hits at exactly the wrong moment. Someone falls into a deep sleep and forgets to check it. However it happened, the situation is the same. The one thing keeping your group alive has disappeared, and the nearest living flame is probably a 2-day walk away. Through snow, through the dark, through country that belongs to wolves and cave hyenas and things that don't mind hunting at night. This wasn't a freak event. Fire loss happened throughout the Ice Age, and it's one of those survival scenarios we almost never actually discuss. We spend enormous amounts of time on how ancient humans made fire. Basically no time on what happened the moment they lost it. That's a shame, because the answer to that question is one of the better windows we have into how these people actually planned and prepared. So, what really happened when the fire went out, and how did people with no lighter, no matches, and no real backup plan make it through anyway? To get there, you first need to understand what fire meant to someone living through a glacial period, not in an abstract sense, but as a daily practical reality. During the height of the last ice age, average temperatures across Europe and northern Asia sat well below anything most of us have personally experienced, and they stayed there for months at a time. Fire was what made questionable water drinkable, because boiling killed what would otherwise kill you. It was what converted raw meat from a parasite risk into actual calories your body could use. It kept predators outside. Almost nothing wanted to approach an open flame and the smell of smoke. Fire dried, soaked furs before hypothermia got a foothold. And it did something else, something less obvious but maybe just as important. It gave the group a reason to stay in one place. Without it, in total darkness, in serious cold, the instinct to scatter is strong. People drift, panic quietly, get disoriented. Fire held a group together physically in a way nothing else did. And there's a physiological layer to this that's easy to miss. Humans are not built for serious cold the way other Ice Age animals were. We lost most of our body hair somewhere in the deep past, probably as a trade-off for better temperature regulation during endurance hunting and heat. That trade-off worked brilliantly on the savanna and cost us enormously in the glacial north. Fire wasn't just useful. It was compensating for a genuine biological vulnerability. A cave lion didn't need fire to survive a glacial winter. We did. That dependency is baked into our evolutionary history at this point, which makes losing fire during an ice age something more specific than just losing a useful tool. It was the sudden removal of the one adaptation that made this habitat survivable for a species like us at all. Pull all of that away at once, in the middle of a snowstorm, and you're not looking at a bad night. You're looking at a clock that's already running. The first few hours after a fire went out were, by every account we can reconstruct from the archaeological record and from cold climate hunter-gatherer societies studied in modern times, the most dangerous stretch. Cold doesn't kill like a sudden injury. What it does first is make you stupid. Core body temperature drops a few degrees and your judgment starts to go, then your coordination. You make small mistakes and they compound fast. So the immediate, almost reflexive response was to consolidate. Bodies pressed together inside whatever shelter existed. Every fur and hide got pooled. Not spread out for individual sleeping, but stacked together to cover as many people as possible. Movement mattered even before anyone could go outside. Stomping in place, swinging arms, anything that kept blood moving out to the fingers and toes. Because once those go numb, you've lost your ability to do the thing you desperately need to do next. Darkness was the second problem, and it doesn't get enough credit. Losing fire meant losing the ability to see what was coming. Ice Age Europe was not empty country. Cave hyenas moved into unguarded spaces. Cave lions had no particular reason to fear humans who no longer smelled of smoke. Wolves hunted at night by preference and were good at reading when a group was compromised. Without flame to keep them back, the only tools available were noise and numbers. Staying awake in shifts near the entrance. Staying loud. Talking, calling out, making enough sound to communicate to anything outside that the people in here were still alert and functional and not worth testing. Predators are mostly running a risk calculation. A silent, cold, motionless group is a very different prospect from one that sounds like it's still paying attention. There's also something about these situations that tends to drop out of the popular version of the story. Not everyone in the group faced the same odds. Children lose body heat much faster than adults. They have more surface area relative to their size, and they can't generate warmth through sustained movement the way a healthy adult can. Elderly group members and anyone sick or injured had far less margin than the rest. What we see in both the archaeological record and in cold climate forager societies documented more recently is a consistent pattern. Once a fire went out, the most vulnerable people were moved to the center of the huddle. The strongest positioned themselves around the outside. The driest furs went to whoever needed them most. This wasn't sentiment. It was the same triage logic you see in emperor penguins rotating their coldest members inward on Antarctic ice, except carried out by people who could talk about it, remember who had been exposed longest, and make conscious decisions about the order of priority. Then came the actual work of getting fire back. And this is where the story shifts in a direction that tends to surprise people, because losing a fire wasn't starting from nothing. It was activating a set of backup systems Ice Age groups had clearly built into their regular lives, because they'd clearly needed them before. The better-known method was friction fire starting, the hand drill, a straight wooden shaft spun between the palms, its tip pressed into a wood hearthboard, until the friction builds a tiny coal of hot wood dust. It works. It's also slow, it exhausts your arms, and it has one serious flaw in a glacial winter. The materials have to be dry. Actually dry. In a snowstorm, genuinely dry wood is a limited resource. The more capable version was the bow drill, where a small bow looped around the shaft lets you spin it considerably faster, using body weight and mechanical advantage instead of raw arm strength. Upper body fatigue goes down, spin speed goes up. Archaeological reconstruction and experimental work both support the idea that some form of bow-assisted drilling was available to Upper Paleolithic groups, and modern researchers working with only period-accurate materials can reliably produce a working coal in a matter of minutes, assuming conditions cooperate. The problem is that both friction methods share the same core weakness. Wet or damp material stops them, which is why the second method often mattered more in real situations. Percussion fire starting involves striking a hard stone against pyrite, a natural iron sulfide mineral, sometimes called marcasite, which produces sparks hot enough to ignite very fine, prepared tinder. And here's where it stops being theoretical. At Neanderthal sites in France, archaeologists have recovered pieces of pyrite with specific linear strike marks on them. The wear pattern left by repeated impact from a stone tool, and exactly the pattern you'd create making fire. These weren't random scratches from general use. The marks are distinctive, and the pieces were clearly being carried, kept, and returned to over time. People were traveling with fire kits, the same way you carry a lighter today and keep a backup somewhere accessible, because you've already lived through being caught without one. That Pyrite evidence is direct physical proof that Ice Age people had worked out, from accumulated experience, that fire could be lost, and that the right moment to prepare for it was before it happened. Tinder was its own quiet area of expertise. Certain fungi, particularly types that grow on birch and similar cold climate trees, can be dried and processed into a material that holds a spark and smolders rather than flashing out immediately. Inner bark, shredded down to something almost fibrous, worked the same way. Groups living through repeated glacial winters would have known exactly which materials in their local territory held a spark, well, where those materials grew, and how to dry and store them near an active fire so they'd be ready when needed. The stored tinder tells you something important. This disaster was expected. You don't build a supply chain for an emergency you've never imagined facing. When personal methods failed, when the storm made everything too wet, or the stored tinder had run out, or the cold had gone deep enough that hands wouldn't cooperate, there was one more option. The most human one. You went and got fire from someone else. Ice Age bands were not living in isolation. Evidence is spread across the archaeological record in the form of shared tool styles, similar ornament traditions, and raw materials found hundreds of kilometers from their geological source. Groups maintained contact with each other. They traded, visited, and almost certainly helped each other in emergencies. Because the alternative, mutual isolation in a landscape this hostile, was a losing strategy for everyone. In virtually every cold climate forager society that's been studied in modern times, fire is something you can borrow, something you share in emergencies, something that creates obligation between groups. A runner sent out to a neighboring camp, carrying clay or wrapped hides to protect embers on the way back, was probably a realistic and fairly common response to fire loss. And the firekeeper. Whoever in the group held specific responsibility for watching the coals overnight so none of this ever became necessary, was almost certainly a recognized role. A job. Because if that one person failed at it, the cost wasn't abstract. Sometimes it was catastrophic. The archaeological record includes sites where hearths go cold and no one ever comes back. Shelters that look abandoned in a hurry without the careful preparation you'd expect from a deliberate departure. We can't say for certain how many of those trace back to a fire that couldn't be relit in time before the cold, or the dark, or something outside made the decision. Some of them almost certainly do. Not every group that faced this survived it. For every band that struck a spark from pyrite at the right moment or made it to a neighboring camp and back, there may have been another that ran out of options first. That's the version of the story that left no one to remember it. What holds up across the whole picture isn't really the danger. It's how little of the response was improvised. Fire kits traveled with the group. Emergency tinder was kept dry and ready near an active fire. Social ties to neighboring bands were maintained, in part precisely because they were survival infrastructure. Someone watched the coals every single night. Each of those habits is evidence of an experience that had already happened, had already cost the group something, and had been absorbed into daily life, so the next time went differently. We have a habit of imagining Ice Age life as something that simply happened to people, a brutal environment they endured because they had no other options. But the way people responded to losing fire doesn't look like endurance. It looks like engineering. People who had already survived the worst version of a crisis thought carefully about it and changed how they lived so the margin would be better next time. The materials were stone, wood, fungus, and each other. The method was learning fast and not forgetting it. One more thing that's worth a moment. Nearly every major culture on Earth, separated by oceans and centuries, ended up with some version of the same story, a figure who steals fire from the gods, an ancestor who carries the first ember across a catastrophe at enormous personal cost, a guardian eternally punished for handing flame to people who were never supposed to have it. These myths didn't persist because ancient people had nothing else to talk about. Fire was genuinely never ordinary to them. It was something you earned back, sometimes barely, and then protected with everything you had. Next time you light a match and think nothing of it, that half second is older than it looks.